so we're grabbing some of the equipment.
It's World UFO Day.
Sorry, World UFO Day, not even the nation, but the whole world celebrates that today. Grabbing some equipment, throwing it into the old alien tracker, and heading out into the field today. Yeah, so it's got to be true.
Definitely.
And look,
true.
they got UFO beer. It's been almost 70 years since a UFO sighting in this area here of Military Trail and Hypoluxa. South Florida was a hot spot for UFOs and still is to this day.
We can see a Checkers and a Walgreens and pretty much everywhere we look. In 1952, it was farmland, cow pastures, tomato fields, no stoplights, no stop signs, very little traffic. Everything you see now is just very rural.
A little bit more on that subject later, but right now we're heading out to our own spot that'll be dark, hopefully, and just hidden enough. It's going to be an undisclosed location where we can kind of monitor this area tonight on what is known as World UFO Day. Some of the equipment you may need is a nice tripod, but with a standard camera, what you want to look for is the optical zoom. Such as in the case, this is a 60 power optical zoom. The higher the number, the better of the quality of optical zooming it will give you. Digital zoom will have a tendency to pixelate. I wouldn't get anything less than a 30. One other suggestion is to set your camera on an infinity focus. See that symbol there, the mountains? A lot of times you see camera footage that is focusing in and out, focusing in and out. Of course, the worst camera in the world, right? That's what you grab in order to film a UFO, and it never seems to focus on it. If you set your camera for infinity focus, it will immediately be focusing out as far as possible. All right, so Dr. J, give us the scoop on these Boy Scouts and Scoutmaster now.
Well, let's see, I was just a little kid at the time. No, that was a little before my time. It was the late summer of 1952 here in South Florida. And as we mentioned earlier, there was nothing here but farmland, tomato fields, cow pastures, woods, nothing. And it was a Scoutmaster. It's become known as the Florida Scoutmaster case. Sonny Desvergers was the local Scoutmaster, and he was taking a couple of kids home from their meeting about 8 o'clock at night. And they were driving on, I think they were headed south on Military Trail, which is like a little 2-lane road back then. And they thought they saw a bright light in the woods. So they turned around and checked it out, and they thought maybe it was an airplane that had crashed because there was a nearby Lantana airfield, small little thing. And Sonny told the kids to wait in the car and wait 15 minutes, and if he wasn't back by then, to go get help. Help in those days being whoever happened to have a house in the area, and there weren't too many of them. Sonny took off to investigate it, and the kids waited and waited, and he didn't come back, so they went and they knocked on somebody's door, and that somebody called the sheriff. Sheriff's deputy came out just in time to see Sonny stumbling out of the woods, out of breath and sweating, and just, and long story short, he claimed he saw this saucer hovering above the trees, the pine trees, and then it kind of lowered, and he went in there. He was chopping through the woods with his machete, and he claimed to hit, he had this weird odor, and then it hit him with some sort of like a beam or something, and he was sunburned, and well, firstly he was hysterical, so they called in a couple more sheriff's deputies just to calm him down. And Blue Book got wind of it, and in those days Captain Edward Ruppelt was in charge of Blue Book, the only time Blue Book was ever in competent hands. And he actually flew down here with one of his other officers to investigate, to interview the sheriff's deputies, to interview Sonny, and they verified he was badly sunburned on his face and his hands, and they had the machete that he used and the flashlight. Oh, and he was wearing a ball cap too, sort of like this one, and the edges were singed, so Sonny took them back out in the woods where it happened, and there was quite a bit of burnt stuff on the ground. And the curious part about that was they actually took soil samples and sent them back to wherever they sent them to, probably Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in those days for a chemical analysis, almost as an afterthought. Meanwhile, Captain Ruppelt did some digging, and Sonny had served in the Marines during World War II, was dishonorably discharged, he worked in a hardware store, was a teller of tall tales. And I've always been of the opinion that UFO encounter that night in 1952 is probably the only time in his life that Sonny's Dispergers was telling the truth. Because Ruppelt went on to write one of the best UFO books of all time, The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. Ruppelt, I never know how to pronounce his name, he also coined the term unidentified flying object because he wasn't comfortable with flying saucers. And in that book, he was really close to labeling a hoax until the analysis came back on the stuff, the soil samples and the burned weeds. And they said, well, yeah, these weeds were exposed to something, but how did the roots get burned and charred? They could never explain that.
Well, the grass blades were fine, but the roots were charred,
Yeah,
wasn't it?
Yeah. That was the big question mark over that case.
Wasn't there something about a mist, or a red haze or something along that
There
line?
was, he did describe that. And a funny smell, he described like almost an ozone kind of smell, like a mechanical engine kind of smell, which as the years went by would become kind of common in close encounter cases, that same odor.
So one thing that I kind of found curious is there might be some similarities to Flatbush because there was a toxin release, I think, at that time too.
You mean Flatwoods?
Flatwoods,
West
sorry.
Virginia.
Yeah, West Virginia.
That was the same year.
Same year.
And it was in the same kind of wooded area, remote, children involved. A misty thing, kind of that strange mechanical, like electromagnetic, whatever ozone smells like. But if you walk into a machine shop, you're going to smell something like that.
Yeah. So that kind of a similarity. There was no monster, here
Well, as the years
in
went
Florida.
by, Sonny, not surprisingly, embellished that story. The initial report was a flying saucer hovering with a beam of light and this misty kind of thing. But as the years went by, he was in hand-to-hand combat with the aliens and just stuff that he never told the Air Force.
Yeah. Well, your light fading off at the time you said that
But
he
in
was
those
hand-to-hand
days, that was
combat
before the National Enquirer. There was no place for him to go to sell his story and have his 15 minutes of fame. And so he just pretty much went off into obscurity.
Yeah.
Except in the UFO culture.
Well, let me ask you though, because he had these kids here, what were their kind of reaction as far as we know, historically speaking?
From what I've read over the years, they went back, they were re-interviewed years later when they were adults and their stories were consistent. That they didn't see a flying saucer, they saw a bright light, that maybe there was something on fire in the woods, and that their Scoutmaster was visibly shaken, and that they remember him being interviewed by the sheriff's deputies, but their story never changed. First, because they didn't really see anything extraordinary, but they were convinced that something happened to Sonny.
Okay.
And where that sighting happened was roughly at the intersection of what they call High Paluxo Road, which is an east-west artery. Back then it was a two-lane north-south thing, might have been Shell Rock, but it wasn't until the mid-50s that they began to expand it. And it was called Military Trail initially so that the military could get down here.
Okay.
Which they did in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. By that point it had been widened and paved to 4 lanes. And I remember my parents telling me about all the military heading south down to Homestead Air Force Base in Key West. There is a reason why they call it Military Trail.
So even at that time in the 50s, it was connecting military bases in the area.
Right, because that was before there was an interstate. And
was there any military bases actually within quick flying distance?
One had been reactivated. Morrison Field had been activated in West Palm Beach during World War II and was reactivated during the Korean War. And there was also Lantana Air Force Civilian Field, which was much closer, which is why Sonny thought maybe a plane had crashed in the woods. Now that you mentioned it, Ruppelt did fly down from Ohio, and they landed at Morrison Field, which is now Palm Beach International Airport.
Okay. I had heard a story a long time ago, too, that Ruppelt only came down here because he actually had a girlfriend in the area. I don't know if you've ever read anything about that.
I've never heard about that one, no.
Yeah, that he wasn't really all that interested, but he came for that.
I'm just impressed that they would get their hands on an old, war surplus B-25 medium bomber and fly down from Ohio to here, and actually, which was the exception, because Hynek was associated with Blue Book at that point, but he never came down here. It got to the point where, as the years went by, when there was a case that became nationally famous, they would send Hynek out to talk to the press and have some veneer of scientific credibility. But Hynek never mentioned in any of his writings. He had nothing to do with it. It was Ruppelt, showing good initiative.
All on his own doing
and
that.
Unfortunately, I keep saying Ruppelt, maybe it's Ruppelt. He was a reserve Air Force officer who was activated when the Korean War broke out. And then when the Korean War was over, he was deactivated, and that's why he left Project Blue Book and left the Air Force. Interesting postscript about Captain Everett Ruppelt. After he left the Air Force, he got a job for one of the aviation companies out in California. I want to say the North American or Douglas. By that time, his book, The Report on Unidentified Objects, had come out. It was selling reasonably well, very intelligent, still required reading. But he did a revised edition, I think in 1956 or 1957, in which he totally tried to discredit everything he had written before. He died of a heart attack just a couple of years later, relatively young guy, I would say late 30s. And to this day, the theory is that he was under a lot of pressure from whatever aviation company he was working for, saying, hey, you and this flying saucer stuff, you better do something about that book.
So here's a prime example where somebody might film something and it looks close and they say, look, there's a light and there's no sound. I was sitting out here, there was no sound. Now, when you zoom the camera in, it looks like it's something that might be close. And there is, of course, no sound because you're far away from it, but the light can shine very, very brightly. And it looks almost, because it's not moving away or alongside of us, it looks like it's almost a stationary light. However, if you end the film like now, that's all you see. And that's one thing why I get suspicious of films that start and end at certain times without showing the craft or whatever it is completely going over or disappearing afterwards behind a mountain or a tree, and that's it. That's all they show you. I like the uncut full videos of whatever is out there.
Here.
Wait a minute. So now that plane that was heading toward us has that bright light that's in the front, so you're heading toward a plane if you're another pilot. Oh, it's time for me to steer away. Now that plane has turned sideways to us, you can see the blinking lights, navigation lights.
And gone behind the trees.
And gone behind the trees some more to hide from being recorded. That's guided, obviously, by an intelligent being. So anyway, you were saying you're a little weary about airport sightings?
I'm wary of any UFO sightings by airports for obvious reasons. The notable exception being the Chicago O'Hare from, 2006? Broad daylight, the thing goes vertical, punches a circular hole in the clouds, lots of credible witnesses. But especially at night, footage around airports, come on.
Yeah. And we're situated between two major airports, even though you wouldn't know it. Or actually one really major airport and one, local field, like the Lantana field that we mentioned about, even existence in 1952, it was down there.
Yep.
Obviously it's a much bigger airport now, but it's still not a major international airport. But just north of us, not too far, in the area of West Palm Beach, is Palm Beach International.
Doppler effect?
Yeah, explain the Doppler effect to everybody.
Well, Dr. P made a very good point about how we can see something but not quite hear it. And it gets closer and closer, and finally we begin to hear it. And that's the Doppler effect. And not to be confused with Doppler radar on your local television station, but Doppler is the best example would be a train going by. You see the train, you begin to hear the train horn, it's like wah, 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 wah.
And there, now you can hear it because it's above us, and the sound would be coming down, bouncing down around there. And as it goes away, it becomes fainter and fainter until you can visually still see it, but you won't be hearing the engine.
Somebody also used train travel as an example of time travel. A train is, if you're looking forward, you're traveling into the future. If you're looking at the end of the train, you're looking into the past. And if you're somewhere in the middle of the train, you're in the present.
Only you're constantly moving forward, so you're always in the future.
Right.
We were sitting here having a good old time. I noticed out of the corner of my eye, very bright light over here. This is not our usual path of any sort of flying vehicle. I want you to take a look at that. You can actually see compared to some of the trees. Now the sound you're hearing of an airplane, maybe perhaps you're hearing it, is actually something way off to our left.
That's another
and
airplane.
Not this. Is this. This is not an airplane right there though. However, because it kind of snuck up on us, could we count it as a UFO? Alright, see Dr. J, I think you're going to have to try to mind meld with that UFO crew up there and tell them to move this way so that way we can verify that it's a... Oh look, it's move. Oh, no, that's just me shaking the camera. Alright, go on and mind meld with it. Ask it to move over here. Alright, we're trying to use the Skywatch here to get an idea. I think it might be off a little bit. I mean, we do have Jupiter nearby. Anyway, so my presumption there is that this is Jupiter and Saturn. But Dr. J has some interesting information about Project Blue Book that he'd like to recount for us.
Well, I'm reminded back in the 1960s when I was in elementary school, in one of my classrooms there was a map of the solar system. A color map, but not photographs. It was a hand-painted map of the solar system and the 9 planets and the sun, and that was all real cool. And then until a few years later, I saw a picture taken in the office of Project Blue Book at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, and there was Major Hector Quintanilla in charge, posing with another officer, maybe a sergeant, and a civilian lady secretary, and in the background there was that same goofy 1950s map of the solar system in the background. Now, did somebody put that up as a joke in the Blue Book office, or was that actually how they tracked UFOs back then? UFO beers.
The show is not brought to you by them.
But it should be.
But how could you not pass up enjoying a UFO beer on World UFO Day? Good night, planets. I think that's it for us. The only UFO we saw tonight was planets, and interesting enough, interesting lights that turned into airplanes later. So we do come up with a theory that flying saucers, or UFOs, are morphing into airplanes as they get closer.
Morphing.
To disguise.
Morphing. Did you just make that word up?
Morphing?
Morphing?
Yeah, morphing.
I thought that was a drug thing.
No, that's morphing.
Oh.